Hello everyone. Today's video I hope will be a chill one. None of that cinematic garbage that I've been doing or trying to do recently. Just the good old-fashioned way, talking to you like this, which I feel like I haven't done in a very long time. Now I wanted to provide a few quick life updates before we move on too much, and that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to do this video like this. Is, well, apparently, probably you've seen at this point, but there's quite a change in scenery. So I moved within Tokyo and I've been settling into my new apartment. I'm also changing jobs. So there's been so many changes going on in my life, and that's maybe why you've seen me a little bit more on the quiet end on the internet recently. Some of you may or may not know too that I work in the sustainability industry. I do consulting for Japanese companies here on like human rights, environmental topics, and I'm taking on a bigger role from April, so also that transition has been a pretty big one. Yeah, so that's kind of what's been going on, exciting times for me. Anyways, thanks for listening to my little life story. After the Canon G7X Mark II video reached so many people, I guess, I got a lot of questions about the settings that I use and how I use the camera. So I wanted to go through that in this video, although it's going to be quite simple. Okay, so I finally set everything up. I'm really not used to this top-down stuff and all this fancy camera work, but yeah, let's get into the settings of the Canon G7X Mark II. I have it right here with a top-down camera. I hope you guys can see this. So let's turn the camera on, and one of the first things that I like doing is to change the display settings. And by doing this, you get a clean screen with no distractions, and that's kind of how I like it. It helps me to concentrate on the thing that I'm taking photos of and the scenes in front of me. So first things first you do that by pressing info a few times, like that. Cool. Next is the f-stop, or the aperture. For you beginners there, aperture is one way of controlling the light that comes into the camera, and physically how it functions is people know this as bokeh. The lower it goes, the more blurry the image becomes, and I guess you get that more professional quote-unquote look. With the Canon G7X Mark II though, since it's a 1-inch sensor, which means the sensor is much smaller than bigger cameras, you really don't get much bokeh, so I would give up on that. However, since having lower apertures helps the camera brighten the image up, or helps bring in more light, for this camera, I actually like setting it to the lowest setting available. To explain a little bit more, so if you're shooting on a full frame camera or maybe even an APS-C sensor, what happens is, if the lower the f-stop, then the more blurry your image goes. And that actually affects, the visuals of your image. So you actually want to control that as much as possible. You don't want to obliterate the black background all the time. But the thing is, again, with this camera, since it's not really obliterating the background all the time, I actually like to keep it as low as possible at all times. So in order to do that with this camera, I actually have the f-stop, or the aperture, set to this ring here. Mine is super old and it's getting a little bit janky, but what this does is it helps me control the aperture by rotating it. So I just crank it all the way like that. And the confusing thing with the G7X Mark II is that depending on the focal length or how much you zoom with this camera, the minimum aperture changes. So this is zoomed out the most right now. So this is the widest setting. So you get f1.8. But once I start zooming in, see, it turned to f2.8 here. And so with this camera, the more you zoom in, the f-stop becomes around f2.8 or 2.5. So just keep that in mind. But it changes automatically, so you really don't have to think about it too much. Similarly, the aperture setting for me is super important because I primarily shoot this AV mode, which means aperture priority. And this means that all you do is set the aperture and everything else the camera does automatically outside of that. So ISO and shutter speed is automatic, but the aperture or the f-stop is something that you control. And you might think that, well, professional photographers, shoot manual and all that stuff. Maybe that's true, but that's not always the case actually. Especially when it comes to smaller cameras like this, you don't really have many dials to work with and the screen's really small. So I actually like to keep things super simple and keep it as automatic as possible. If you want to control things on this camera, you can set it to this manual mode by this dial here. That also works. But again, yeah, I tend to keep things like maybe 90% of the time I use this AV mode. The other 10% I might use this TV mode, which means shutter speed priority. So if I want to do slow shutter stuff, then I change it to the shutter speed priority, and then that helps me get, more blurry images or something like that. Another thing that I typically like to do with my cameras is that I usually set my exposure to around -0.3 or sometimes -1 depending on the situation. What that does is I like shooting heavy dense colors. So what that does is it helps me lower down the highlights and all the glare that comes from the highlights or the sun. And then it gives me these punchier colors in these brighter situations. So yeah, usually -0.3 and sometimes -1. If I'm intentionally kind of blowing out highlights or making the image super bright, then yeah, obviously I'd go to the additional +1s and whatnot. But again, most of the time my camera sits at around -0.3 to -1 exposure. Another thing I like doing with my cameras in general, and this might be a little bit different from most people, but in terms of autofocus, I typically like to choose just this one single point autofocus. What that means is the camera focuses on one single point that's usually center to the camera. You can move it around too. But how to use that actually is you point the camera to something that you want to focus at, and then you recompose. So you go like that. If I want to take a thing of this video camera, I would half click and then I would move the frame to recompose. I don't know, I just got used to shooting that way. Maybe it's a little bit too old school, I don't really know, but if I'm using autofocus, that's how I use the camera. Lastly, and this is probably the most asked question that I got, is I shoot in RAW, even though it's this little tiny camera. RAW means you get the most information out of your image, and it's a little bit bland though when you get the image. So if you're a beginner, it might be a little bit complicated because you're not maybe that good at editing photos, and that's something that needs practice. In that case, yeah, JPEG is totally fine, I think. But just for me, because I've been shooting for years and years and years, and I know that I'll be shooting more and more going forward too. It's nice to know that I get as neutral as possible image so that I can edit it the way I want whenever I'm going to be using that image going forward. If I'm looking back into my archives and I want to maybe archive it or create a project out of all these images, then maybe I want to edit it in a certain fashion. So that's kind of the logic behind why I guess more professional photographers use RAW. So for those of you that asked if I use this a filter or some kind of image profile within this camera, the answer sadly is no. And with that in mind, you might be asking how I achieve a more kind of filmy or more vintagey vibe to my images. I can answer that, but before we do that, let's get to the sponsor of today's video, which is NordVPN. So today's sponsor is NordVPN. As a photographer and a creator, it's really important that my social media account is safe. And what I mean by that is because a lot of my work and my presence is based off of social media, sadly. What Nord helps is, by providing a dedicated IP address when I log in, it helps protect my credentials, so less people hacking into or attempting to hack into my Instagram account, my YouTube account. That helps a lot with my life. So go check out Nord. They are a risk-free VPN. I provided a special affiliate link down below. If you're interested, sign up through that. The link is nordvpn.com/Ulysses Aoki. You get a 30-day money-back guarantee. And in addition, exclusive to the link below, if you sign up for the 2-year plan, you receive 4 months for free. Thanks, back to the video. So after all that, perhaps a lot of you may still have the question remaining of, how certain images look so filmy or colorful or whatever it is. And I want to give you an honest answer from my heart. I would say over the years, shooting a lot and shooting intensely, but also getting to know great photographers, through just in person. I'm learning that most of the time the magic is in the photographer's eyes. It depends on what scenes they shoot in. It depends on how they evaluate the scene. It depends on what photos they end up choosing. All of these factors matter. And sadly, most of the time, the elements that I just mentioned end up being the answer, as opposed to the more common misunderstanding of, it depends on what focal length they use, or what camera they use, or, if they use film or not. I wouldn't say those things don't matter, but when it comes to great photography, those things tend to matter much less than the eye of the photographer itself. With all that in mind, if you still are wondering how to achieve a film look easier, then obviously, that was kind of the whole premise of the Canon G7X Mark II video, is that perhaps shooting with like older point and shoots with shittier sensors and lenses, it does help you achieve a look that's somewhat synonymous with film. And another way you can approach it is through editing. And I made a whole video on that where I barely kind of retouch images that come out of the G7X Mark II. And I also show a tool called Dehancer that helps helps create more filmy images. And I do like using that sometimes too. It's kind of like a cheat code, I gotta say. So those were the settings I used for my Canon G7X Mark II. I apologize if it feels a little bit underwhelming, but maybe the message that I want to provide is don't get fooled by YouTube marketers out there. In this case, even including myself. I advise you to get a camera that you like and stick to it, keep on shooting with it, and try to understand the ins and outs of the camera itself to see what kind of results you can get. My G7X Mark II these days is like really falling apart. Sometimes it doesn't turn on, the lens is just like crooked and all that stuff. But I still like it, and I'm very happy that the video I made on the G7X Mark II, which apparently many people just kind of had lying around in their house, and apparently it has kind of sparked the interest of just grabbing that camera and taking photos outside for many people. So thank you very much, that was the video. Again, if you want an apartment tour, I guess, I can do that. Let me know if you have any other questions down below in the comment section. Excited for everything going forward, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.